My name is Shayla Dean. I'm 27 years old, a digital marketing CEO based in Atlanta, and if you'd asked me a few years ago, I'd have told you I'd made peace with my past, that I'd moved on, that I didn't need closure or approval or apologies from people who never cared to give them. But then my sister got married, and I found myself holding a microphone, standing in front of 200 people in a ballroom that smelled like lilies and expensive champagne, about to say something I had sworn I'd never say out loud. I didn't come to ruin a wedding. I'm not that kind of woman. But when the lies pile up for so long, they start to choke you. And that day, I couldn't swallow it anymore. But before I tell you what I said, what really happened, let me take you back. Let me tell you who I am and why this moment mattered so damn much. I wasn't born into tragedy. Not exactly. My childhood was the kind that looks normal from the outside. My mother, Elaine, was a school principal, strict and sharp. The kind of woman who believed excellence was the bare minimum. My father, Grant, was a real estate broker with a booming laugh and a temper that simmered just beneath the surface. We lived in a neat 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb with trimmed hedges and the illusion of a picture-perfect life. But picture-perfect doesn't mean peaceful. I was the second daughter. Rachel, my older sister, came first and she set the tone for everything that followed. Blonde, athletic, dazzling. Rachel was the star. Every dance recital, every spelling bee, every family photo, she was the center. I was just in the frame. I wasn't jealous at first. I just wanted to be included. When I brought home an A, it was, well done. When Rachel brought home a B, it was, she must have had a hard test. When I got promoted to team captain in soccer, my mom barely looked up from her emails. When Rachel got invited to a party, my dad grinned like she'd won an Oscar. You have to understand, my mother would say when I asked why Rachel always got more. She needs more support. You're strong, Shayla, you don't need as much. But being strong became an excuse to ignore me, to place all their hopes in one daughter and all their expectations on the other. By the time I turned 16, I'd figured it out. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't even in the running. So I left. Not literally, of course. But I pulled away. I buried myself in books, in code, in social media algorithms and startup blogs. I taught myself to build websites before I graduated high school. By 22, I launched my first business. By 25, I turned it into a 7-figure company. No inheritance, no family support. Just me, working nights while my peers were still figuring themselves out. You'd think that would have earned me a little recognition. But at every family dinner, it was still, Rachel just started a new job. Or, Rachel's friend got her into that Pilates studio. No one ever asked me what I did unless it was to ask if I could help Rachel get more followers on Instagram. Still, I smiled. I showed up. I bought gifts. I played the good daughter, the good sister, the professional. Until I couldn't anymore. Rachel's engagement was the final straw. Her fiancé, Blake, came from money. Big money, country club and summer home money. I met him exactly twice before the wedding. The second time, he called me Shania. My own sister didn't bother correcting him. Planning the wedding was like watching a rom-com written by someone who thought love was a spreadsheet. Rachel gave out tasks like a CEO with a clipboard. I was assigned digital guest management, whatever that meant, and seated at a table with her coworkers who didn't know my name. When I asked if I could give a toast, she laughed. Why would you do that? She said, sipping her green juice. You're not even in the bridal party. I blinked. I'm your only sister. She smirked. Exactly. That should have been the end of it. I should have walked away, packed my bag, and flown back to Atlanta without another word. But something in me cracked. Not the brittle kind of crack that comes from one bad day, but the deep, groaning shift of years of pressure finally breaking bone. I didn't plan to take the mic at her wedding. I didn't write a speech or rehearse one in my head. But when the MC called for anyone who'd like to share a few words and no one moved, my hand went up before I could stop it. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let someone else write my story. I was going to tell the truth. It didn't begin with one moment of betrayal. That would have been easier to name, to contain, to fight. But real damage, the kind that festers for years until it becomes part of your identity, comes from the slow, careful erosion of your worth. And in my family, that erosion began early. But the moment I remember most, the one that took the small fractures and broke me clean in half, happened the day my father rewrote his will. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I just signed a new client that morning, a global brand that had reached out through referral and told me, "You came highly recommended. We want you to run our next launch campaign." I was on cloud nine, proud in that rare way you feel when you know deep in your bones you earned this. No shortcuts, no family favors, no handouts. Just sweat and ideas and persistence. I was so excited I called my dad. I didn't even think twice about it. Just hit dial. That's the thing about being the ignored daughter, you still keep trying. Hoping. I wanted him to be proud, just once. I wanted him to say, "Wow, Shayla, that's incredible. I'm proud of you." That's all. That would have been enough. He picked up on the fourth ring. "Hey," he said, his voice half distracted. "Everything okay?" I smiled. "Yeah, actually. I just signed a major client. It's a pretty big deal, could mean expanding the agency. Maybe even opening a second office by next year." There was silence. A pause too long for comfort. Then he replied, "That's nice. I'm actually in the middle of something. Can I call you back?" That was it. Not even a congrats. But it wasn't until 3 weeks later that the real blow came. I was at my parents' house for Sunday dinner, a ritual I used to dread but couldn't fully detach from. Rachel was already there, perched on the velvet ottoman like she owned the place, sipping wine like she belonged in a magazine spread. She looked up when I walked in, scanned my outfit, and gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Still doing that internet thing?" she asked. "It's a digital marketing firm," I replied evenly, setting my purse down. "And, yeah, it's doing well." She shrugged. "As long as it pays the bills, right?" I wanted to say something. I wanted to snap back, to tell her how my internet thing was currently paying for 6 employees' salaries, 2 office leases, and my own penthouse apartment. But I knew better. I'd learned not to feed her condescensions. She grew stronger when you gave her resistance. Dinner was stale, like always. My mother fussed over Rachel's engagement, my dad asked Blake about his father's company, and I mostly pushed green beans around my plate while waiting for the night to end. But then, just as we were clearing the dishes, my dad cleared his throat and said, "I've made some updates to the will." Just like that. Rachel perked up immediately. "Oh, did you finally put the lake house under my name?" she joked. Dad chuckled. "It's not quite that dramatic. Just some adjustments to keep things clean. I didn't want any confusion later on." End of crest. My chest tightened. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I hadn't been consulted. Maybe because he said, "clean," like something messy needed to be sorted. "What kind of adjustments?" I asked. My mother gave me a look. "You know, the kind like I was interrupting something important. Your father's just being responsible, Shayla. It's nothing you need to worry about." But something in me didn't let it go. I'd still like to know. My father looked uncomfortable now, his hands folded tightly on the table. "It's mostly standard. But we've decided that the estate, the house, the savings, the lake property will go to Rachel. She'll take care of things." I blinked. "What do you mean, she'll take care of things? I'm your daughter too." My mom's voice was calm, clinical. "Rachel will handle everything when the time comes. She's here. You live in a different world now." My ears rang. My pulse thudded somewhere behind my eyes. "I built my world from nothing. That doesn't mean I don't belong in yours." "Oh." Rachel tilted her head, lips curling in a mock-sweet smile. "It's not about that, Shayla. It's about responsibility. Someone has to make decisions. And you're busy with your startup or whatever. Dad just thinks it makes sense." I stared at my father. "You're cutting me out." He shifted uncomfortably. "No one's cutting anyone out. It's just simpler this way." "Simpler?" That word echoed in my head like a gunshot in a quiet room. I stood slowly, trying to keep my voice from cracking. So all those years I spent trying to make you see Meadow prove I was worth something they didn't matter? You're just handing everything over to her? My mother narrowed her eyes. Don't make this emotional, Shayla. It's just paperwork. But it wasn't. It never is. Because this wasn't about money or property or legal documents. This was about value. This was about a choice. And once again, they chose her. Rachel, smug and glowing in her designer dress. Me, invisible again, except this time, they signed it into law. That was the night something inside me began to shift. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and opened my laptop. And for the first time, I opened a new folder not for a client, not for a campaign, but for myself. I labeled it Truth. Because someday, they were going to hear it. And I was going to make damn sure they listened. I wish I could say that night was the first time I felt left out, like I was some footnote in my own family story, but that would be a lie. It wasn't new, it was just louder. More undeniable. Like someone had finally turned up the volume on all the quiet dismissals I'd learned to swallow over the years. That dinner, with its cold finality and smiles that didn't reach the eyes, didn't break mate, confirmed what I'd always suspected but never wanted to believe. I was never really part of the picture. I was just a placeholder until Rachel arrived. The next morning, I couldn't get out of bed. Not because I was tired, I was angry, bone-deep angry. The kind of anger that comes from being silenced for so long, you don't even know what your voice sounds like anymore. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the words from the night before playing on a loop. Rachel will take care of things. It's just simpler. Don't make this emotional. How can you not make it emotional when your entire existence is treated like a clerical error? I didn't respond to my parents' follow-up texts that week. My mom sent a picture of Rachel's new wedding dress with a caption that read, "Isn't she stunning?" No question about how I was doing. No check-in. Just more celebration of the golden child. I typed, "She looks like she's playing the role of a bride," and then deleted it. I typed, "Do you even realize what you've done?" and deleted that too. Instead, I sent nothing. Silence had become my armor. But even in silence, the ache didn't let up. I went to my office, me safe place, my world. My team greeted me like they always did, full of energy and admiration. I smiled, answered emails, approved ad creatives, scheduled client strategy meetings, but inside, I felt like I was floating above my own life, watching someone who looked like me but didn't feel like me anymore. I couldn't shake the thought. Why did I still care? I had success, respect, independence. I had built an empire from scratch, while Rachel lived on handouts and curated illusions. But I still wanted them to love me. Still wanted them to see me. That craving felt like a weakness, one I hated myself for. I remember going to lunch that week with my friend and operations director, Naomi. She noticed I was quiet, picking at my salad without eating. "Okay," she said, folding her arms. "What happened?" I shook my head. "It's just family stuff. Stupid, really. Stupid never makes you look like someone just stole your soul." I smiled faintly. "They changed the will. Left everything to Rachel." Naomi blinked. "Wait, everything?" "Yeah. House, property, all of it. I'm not even a footnote." She leaned forward. "Shayla, that's insane. What reason did they give?" I hesitated. "They said she's more available. That she'll take care of things." Naomi scoffed. "Available? She can't even keep a job without her daddy making calls. Meanwhile, you're managing an entire company. That doesn't even make sense." I nodded, but I'd already had this argument 100 times in my head, in my shower, during long commutes. Logic doesn't stand a chance against deep-seated favoritism. It's like trying to rearrange smoke with your hands. After that conversation, I started pulling away more. Not in loud, dramatic ways. Just slowly. A skipped phone call, a missed dinner. A polite decline to yet another wedding planning meeting I hadn't wanted to attend in the first place. My parents noticed but didn't ask. Rachel didn't notice at all. It was Rachel's bridal shower that pushed me over the edge. I showed up because I still believed in being civil. I brought an expensive gifted custom leather-bound photo album with slots labeled for memories they hadn't even made yet. I knew it would be ignored, but I told myself it wasn't about them. It was about who I am. The room was filled with Rachel's college friends, sorority sisters, distant cousins I barely recognized. When Rachel saw me, her smile froze. "Wow," she said, tilting her head. "You actually came." Nice to see you too," I replied, handing her the wrapped box. She took it like it weighed nothing and set it aside. "There's food in the back, you can grab a plate." I stood in a corner most of the afternoon, sipping lukewarm punch, listening to her friends talk about things I wasn't invited to. At one point, one of them leaned in and asked, "So are you Rachel's cousin?" I blinked. "I'm her sister." Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I didn't realize." Of course she didn't. The final insult came during the toast. Rachel stood, raised her glass, and began thanking everyone, her mom, her future mother-in-law, her college besties, even her hairstylist, for being with her every step of the way. She didn't say my name. Not once. I left before dessert. No one followed. That night, I sat alone on my couch, scrolling through photos guests had posted on social media. Rachel glowing, laughing, radiant in a white lace dress. And me? I wasn't in a single frame. I didn't exist in her world. And it finally hit me, maybe I never had. After the bridal shower, I stopped waiting for apologies. Something inside me hardened, not in a cruel or vengeful way, but in that quiet, irreversible way a person changes when they realize the people who are supposed to love them unconditionally have drawn lines in the sand, and your name is written on the outside. I wasn't grieving just the rejection. I was grieving the fantasy I had clung to for too long, the idea that one day they would wake up and see me clearly. That one day I'd come home and not feel like a stranger in my own family. What came next was worse because it wasn't just emotional, it became transactional. It started with the family lake house. A small, cedar cabin on Lake Lanier that my grandfather built with his own hands, long before any of us were born. That cabin held every summer memory I still considered mine: bonfires, cold watermelon on the dock, late-night card games when the power went out during thunderstorms. I loved that place more than anything we'd ever owned, and I thought, foolishly, that memories might hold weight in decisions. I thought if nothing else, they'd at least share it. One day I got a text from Rachel. "We're doing a total remodel of the cabin. Blake's family wants to make it more luxurious. Hope you're not too sentimental about it." No conversation. No invitation to weigh in. Just a mocking emoji and a decision already made. I replied, "I didn't realize we were remodeling. Who's paying for it?" Her answer was quick, brutal. "It's technically mine now. Dad signed it over last month. Thought you knew." I didn't. No one had told me. Not a word. I called my mother, my voice shaking, not out of panic, but out of the kind of disbelief that leaves you numb. "Why didn't anyone say anything about the cabin? Why wasn't I even asked?" Her voice was sharp, practiced. "Because it's already done, Shayla. We didn't think you'd care. You never come up here anymore." "I didn't come because I wasn't welcome," I snapped. "That's not fair," she replied, but the way her voice thinned told me even she didn't believe it. "Rachel gets everything," I said, and I could hear the crack in my own voice now, that slip of old pain leaking through. "Every holiday, every memory, every damn key, and I'm supposed to just clap for her from the sidelines like I'm lucky to be invited?" Silence. Then she said it, the line that sealed it. "Well, maybe if you'd stayed closer to the family instead of running off to build your empire, things would be different." My empire. That's what they called it. As if ambition were a betrayal. As if I had abandoned them when, truthfully, I just refused to play second fiddle to someone who never once treated me like a sister. It didn't end there. A few weeks later, my cousin Harper called to ask if I was attending Grandma Dean's memorial service. I hadn't even heard she'd passed. Apparently, Rachel had posted a tribute on Instagram, but no one had bothered to call me. My grandmother had helped raise me. She taught me how to bake, how to sew, how to defend myself without raising my voice. And I found out about her death through a friend of a friend who saw Rachel's post trending. I flew in that weekend anyway, wearing black, holding back tears that had been building for days. But when I arrived at the church, there was no seat reserved for me. I stood in the back, behind some cousins I barely recognized, listening to Rachel deliver the eulogy like she was the only one who ever mattered. I caught my father's eye once. He looked away. That night, I drove to the lake house. Rachel was there, of course. She was curled up on the porch in a white fleece robe, sipping wine from a crystal glass like she owned the stars. I parked anyway, climbed out, and stood in the driveway for a long minute before walking up the steps. She looked up, and for once, she didn't smile. "Didn't expect to see you," she said. I didn't sit. "You should have told me about Grandma." She shrugged. "I assumed someone else would. It was chaotic." "No, Rachel. You just didn't care." She leaned back, smug. "You always think everything is about you. Maybe that's the real problem." I stared at her, heart pounding, fury curling under my ribs. "You took everything. And you still look at me like I'm the one who should apologize." She stood up then, suddenly bored. "I don't have time for this. You made your choices. You left." "No," I whispered. "I built something. That's not the same as leaving." She walked inside and closed the door without a word. I stood on that porch for what felt like an hour, watching the stars fade behind clouds, knowing with painful clarity that my family didn't just forget me, they erased me. And the worst part? They acted like I should be grateful for the scraps. But I wasn't hungry anymore. And I was done pretending to be. It's strange. The moment you realize you've spent most of your life trying to win a game that was never meant to be fair. I sat at my desk the morning after the lake house, sunlight streaming through the blinds like it didn't know how tired I was, my fingers hovering above the keyboard of my laptop, my coffee cold, untouched. There was a part of me, small, stubborn, aching, that still wanted to believe I could fix this, that if I just achieved one more thing, became someone undeniable, someone too brilliant to ignore, maybe then they'd look up and finally see me. Maybe then they'd say, "That's our daughter too." So I doubled down. I poured myself into work like a woman possessed, chasing clients I used to think were out of reach, closing deals that turned heads even in my competitive industry. I hired 2 new creatives, expanded our platform into London, signed a publishing deal for a marketing trends book I'd been quietly drafting at midnight between strategy decks. I even got featured on a national business podcast, an hour-long episode titled "From Shadow to Spotlight, The Unstoppable Shayla Dean." It went viral in the startup space. My inbox exploded. LinkedIn blew up. People I'd never met were telling me I inspired them. I should have felt powerful. I should have felt like I'd finally arrived. But when I texted the link to my parents, neither of them responded. 2 days later, my mother called about Rachel's bridal shower playlist. "Do you think it should be more classic or more pop-forward?" she asked, like I hadn't just publicly bared my soul about clawing my way through an industry that never made space for girls like me. I said nothing for a moment. Then, "Did you listen to the podcast I sent?" A pause. "I skimmed it. But you know your father doesn't do podcasts. Anyway, about the playlist." And just like that, my voice didn't matter again. But I kept trying. Because part of me still held on to this ridiculous hope that if I showed them how hard I was willing to fight, how much I'd overcome, they'd turn around and say, "We were wrong." That they'd be ashamed of the way they dismissed me. That they'd finally give me something I hadn't dared ask for in years. Recognition. I started planning a charity gala, something I'd wanted to do for years but never had the emotional bandwidth for. I picked a cause close to my heart: mental health resources for young women of color in underserved communities. I booked the venue, reached out to sponsors, designed the branding myself. It was elegant, intimate, and filled with purpose. I even invited my family, though my fingers hesitated on every name I typed into that email list. Rachel never responded. My mom said they had a conflict that night. My dad didn't even RSVP. But the night came anyway. And it was beautiful. There were speeches that made people cry, a silent auction that raised over $80,000, women from all over the city coming up to me with teary eyes, saying, "Thank you for doing this. I needed this. I won." And when the night was over and the lights dimmed and the last champagne flute was cleared, I stood alone on the balcony outside the venue, looking over the city skyline, my heels dangling from one hand, the cool wind brushing against my cheek, and I realized something I hadn't dared admit before. I didn't want their validation anymore. I wanted to be free of needing it. I wanted to live a life that felt like mine, not one that constantly sought approval from people who only ever saw me through the lens of who I wasn't. And yet there was still Rachel's wedding. Still that stage I never asked to stand on. Still that moment coming where I'd be expected to smile, to clap, to hand over a gift and say, "I'm happy for you." Even if it killed me a little more inside. Naomi noticed the shift in me. One afternoon, a week before the wedding, she walked into my office and closed the door behind her. "You look like you're trying to disappear," she said. I glanced up. "Is it that obvious?" She nodded. "You've been pushing yourself harder than ever. And don't get me wrong, it's working, but it feels like you're trying to prove something to someone who isn't even watching." I sighed. "They're watching. Just never the way I want them to." Naomi sat down across from me, her eyes kind. "Shayla, they don't get to define you. Not anymore. You already made it. You already became everything they said you couldn't. You're already more than enough." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But years of silence don't unravel in one conversation. Years of invisible wounds don't heal just because you win. And when the very people who raised you still look through you like you're a smudge on the glass, they leave a shadow behind. Still, something inside me softened that day. Not toward them, but toward myself. I started to understand that recognition from others isn't nearly as powerful as recognizing yourself. That maybe the truest form of justice wasn't revenge, it was living a life so full and unapologetically your own. They had no choice but to sit in their silence while you soared. But there was still something I needed to say. Something I'd carried for too long. And if I couldn't say it at their dinner tables or in their driveways or at holiday brunches where I was always the outsider, then maybe, just maybe, I'd say it when they least expected it. With a microphone. And a truth they couldn't talk over. That week became a pressure cooker of small confrontations, masquerading as polite interactions, all of them tightening the guilt and anger wound inside me. And I felt as though every glance and every overheard whisper was calibrated to remind me of my precarious place in the family hierarchy, where I was always, no matter what I achieved, just beneath notice. It began with a text from my Aunt Caroline, tapped out with forced cheer. "So excited to celebrate Rachel's big day. XOXO. Can't wait to see you, Shyla." But her typing Shyla instead of my correct name. Shayla felt like someone had flicked a nerve, because it wasn't just a typo, it was a symptom. This wasn't about me. Not really. And even in their excitement, they couldn't be bothered to see me properly. They saw the almost right version but skipped the subtle acknowledgement of who I actually am. And suddenly I was furious for being so kind to the kind. Later that afternoon, as I walked into the florist shop where we were picking up centerpieces for the rehearsal dinner, because despite everything I wanted so desperately to belong, I found Rachel's fiancé, Blake, arranging vases with a stiff expression and cool efficiency, and he glanced at me with mild surprise, and then disdain, and said, "Nice of you to show up, Shayla." As though it had been a struggle for me to attend, as though I had earned no place there, and his tone was the kind you use with someone whose presence you tolerate at best, someone whose status you've already decided not to elevate. And I realized in that moment how deeply this family had carved out lines in the sand around each of us, and I was firmly planted outside all of them. That evening, during the rehearsal dinner, my parents sat me at a table with Blake's cousins, two women who hadn't introduced themselves to me until seconds before the appetizers arrived. and they immediately launched into a monologue about their mutual love for real estate investment that carried on for 15 minutes without a single question directed at me. As though I were a potted plant or part of the decor, and their laughter soared around the table like balloons that rose too fast, leaving the air empty and making me feel as though the room held only the married couple and I was an echo, one they had allowed to reverberate for a moment just to fill the silence. After the main course was over, my father leaned in quietly, but with that tone you use when you're delivering something you already regret, he said. "Your mom and I have been talking about maybe finding you a place here, in the wedding photos. You wouldn't want to feel left out." There was a pause heavy enough to crush dreams. He continued, "But you have to come closer during the group shot, stand near Rachel." I pressed my lips together, my heart clenching at the unintentional cruelty of it all. Because moving closer for a photo wasn't inclusion, it was tokenism. It was a half step that highlighted everything I hadn't gotten: love, recognition, respect, and it reminded me that even as an adult, they still thought I needed permission to exist in their world. I forced a smile and replied, "Sure." And in that moment, I understood how easily anyone can become a prop in someone else's narrative. The worst confrontation happened the next morning, the day before the wedding, when we gathered for brunch at my parents' house to go over the seating chart and day of schedule. Ostensibly straightforward logistics dressed up in familial affection, and what it quickly became was a battlefield of power and entitlement, of demands and coded threats. Rachel's maid of honor, her college roommate Jess, arrived late, hair perfect, and immediately blamed me for moving a chair so the bridesmaids could stand together, her voice tight. "I mean, come on. Someone needs to help out here. Would have been easier if you hadn't been so distant." That word, distant, fell across the table like a verdict. I realize now it was never about chairs, or seating, or wedding schedules. It was about control, reminding me I was not one of them, that wherever I stood would always be just beyond the perimeter. Then Rachel herself snapped. "Why don't you just take this afternoon off, Shayla? Go back to Atlanta. I'm sure your team will understand." She said it in front of everyone, like a command disguised as sisterly concern, and my mother even nodded, pressing her lips thinly as though the world were black and white, and my worth hung on my ability to follow orders quickly and without fuss. I felt the weight of their dismissal settle around me, heavy as lead in my chest, and I nearly stood up and left, but something deep inside, something I could barely name, held me there, listening. Because every microaggression, every backhanded invitation, every passing, "You're welcome to stay if you want," was a reminder that if I remained, I would either break or I would build fire. I did neither. Instead, I leaned forward, rested my elbows on the table, and looked at Rachel with eyes calm and fierce. "I'm staying," I said. "For family, for you." My voice trembled, not with fear, but with the stillness of steeled emotion. "Because this is your day, and I'm here." Her jaw clenched, my mother's gaze sharpened, and for a moment, the room froze. It was a turning point disguised in polite restraint, where I chose presence over retreat, where I claimed my stake in the story even as they worked to rewrite it. I had nothing left to prove except that I would not vanish quietly. Later that afternoon, when I walked into my childhood bedroom searching for my old wedding dress from a long-ago prom, I found the closet door closed, locked, as though they'd anticipated I might need something from the past, but ensured I couldn't access it. Rachel's fiancé's cousin, unbidden, leaned in and whispered, "It's probably better you don't go in there," as though someone had painted a neon sign above me. "Stay in your lane." I retrieved an old dress from memory, not attic or closet, and wore it anyway to the rehearsal dinner, and even as I crossed that threshold I realized, owning my place meant dressing myself in my history, even when they closed the doors. That night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the air conditioner, mind churning with every moment I'd been told I didn't belong. Every passive-aggressive smile, every silencing look, every redirection that reduced me to a missing piece, and I knew that tomorrow I would show up again. Because the story wasn't about the meat, was about me, about how I chose to keep breathing, to keep standing, to keep naming my place, even when they tried to erase it. And something in me unlocked. Every moment of disrespect, of division, of dismissal became fuel, a quiet fire building beneath my skin, and I realized I wasn't preparing to take the mic. I was preparing to rise, to exist, with or without their permission. The night before the wedding was the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, it unsettles, like the air just before a storm, still and heavy, pressing down on your chest as if the sky itself had chosen you to punish. I lay in the twin bed of my childhood bedroom, the one that once held dreams of college and freedom and soft futures, now stripped bare except for a flat pillow and a faded quilt my mother hadn't bothered to replace. The walls still held the same color, pale green, but none of the warmth, none of the posters or sticky notes or photos I'd taped up in high school. It had become a hollow museum to a version of me no one had ever really wanted to know, a room kept only for the sake of appearance, like a token of maternal duty or a space for storing what they didn't quite want to throw away but had long since stopped loving. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the laughter downstairs. Rachel's voice clear and musical, her bridesmaids shrieking at some joke. Blake laughing too loud, and I realized that this was the most alone I had felt in my entire life, not because there weren't people in the house, but because none of them would come looking for me if I disappeared. I was a ghost haunting a home that used to be mine, invisible except for the moment I accidentally stepped into their line of sight and disrupted the performance they had choreographed so carefully without me. The clock blinked 1:12 a.m. When I finally got out of bed and padded quietly down the hallway, barefoot, holding my breath like I used to when I was 12, and trying to sneak into the kitchen for ice cream after everyone had gone to sleep. But this time, I wasn't looking for sweetness. I just needed silence that didn't echo. I needed to remember that I was still real. I stepped out onto the back porch, wrapped my arms around myself, and looked up at the sky. It was black and endless and careless, dotted with stars that burned billions of miles away, as indifferent as my family, beautiful and out of reach. I whispered to no one, "I don't know why I keep hoping," and the breeze answered nothing. I sat down on the old wooden bench, the one my dad used to stain every spring before he stopped asking me to help, and I let the tears come not loud or dramatic, just slow and steady, like a leaking pipe behind the wall. I cried for the girl who once brought home straight A's and waited for someone to notice. I cried for the woman who built an empire just to be seen and still wasn't. I cried for the empty seat at my grandmother's memorial, for the erasure from the will, for the locked closet, and for every moment I smiled through gritted teeth just to keep the peace in a war I never started. And then I cried because I didn't know who I was outside of this fight. That was the part that scared me, the quiet truth I couldn't shake. I had spent so long trying to prove myself to people who refused to claim me, that I didn't know if I would still be whole if I stopped needing their approval. My identity had become a rebellion, and I didn't know how to be more than just not Rachel, not the favorite, not the chosen one. I took my phone out of my hoodie pocket, stared at the screen for a long time. No new messages, no missed calls. Just a social feed filled with filtered joy and artificial celebration. Rachel had posted a boomerang of her bridesmaids clinking glasses. The caption read, "Couldn't do this without my soul sisters. Number bride vibes." I wasn't tagged. I never was. I clicked over to my messages and hovered over Naomi's name. I thought about texting her, telling her I couldn't breathe. That I felt like a child trying to shout through soundproof glass while the people inside smiled and posed and toasted their future without ever noticing me pressed up against the other side. But I didn't hit send. What could she say that would make this stop hurting? My fingers moved without thinking, scrolling up to an old thread with my dad. The last message from me was a photo of our gala night, where I had given a speech that moved 100 people to tears. I'd written, "Wish you could have been there." His response had been a thumbs-up emoji. That was 3 weeks ago. I closed the app and let the phone drop into my lap. The wind picked up, and it felt like it was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear, that the world could keep spinning just fine without my pain, that maybe this family was never mine to begin with, that perhaps I had built my success in the image of rejection and now I didn't know how to exist without that mirror. It's a strange thing to realize your loneliness isn't circumstantial, it's structural, woven into the very fabric of your history, reinforced by every silence and every missed invitation and every narrowed eye that measured your worth against someone else's charm. And I hated how even now, even after all I had accomplished, my loneliness could still swallow me whole. It felt like failure. I pressed my hand over my mouth and sobbed, not just for being excluded, but for the version of me that had accepted that exclusion for so long. For the girl who had made herself smaller and quieter and more accommodating in the hopes that someone would reward her with affection. For the woman who had spent years in therapy learning not to hate herself for never being chosen. And still, even in that bottomed-out moment of despair, a small, tired voice in the back of my mind whispered, "You're still here. You're still breathing. You're still Shayla Dean." And I held onto that thought like a life raft. Because somewhere deep inside, I knew this couldn't be where it ended. Not for me. The morning of the wedding came wrapped in that strange kind of calm that only follows a sleepless night where your body feels like a shell that has stopped arguing with exhaustion. And your thoughts have gone quiet not because they've resolved, but because they've run out of breath. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at me, her eyes dark and sunken. Her lips pressed into the kind of neutral line that looks like silence but is actually restraint. I hadn't slept. I hadn't cried again. I hadn't spoken to anyone. I had simply waited for this day to arrive like a verdict, like a final performance in a play where I never got a script. I dressed in navy blue, a color that felt honest, not desperate to please or disappear. As I walked into the venue, a grand estate-style winery draped in blush florals and polished marble, I felt the familiar chill of being tolerated. The bridesmaids fluttered around in soft silk robes. Someone handed me a seat assignment with the indifference reserved for background extras, and no one asked how I was or if I needed anything. Not Rachel, not my mother. Not a single soul in that room where my presence had been reduced to obligation. But just as I was preparing to take my assigned seat, something unexpected happened, something that cracked the cement of silence that had hardened around my life for far too long. Naomi showed up. She wasn't supposed to be there. She'd declined the invitation because she was flying out to a leadership conference in Chicago, but there she was, standing in the courtyard in a sleek black dress and fire-red heels, holding a small clutch and scanning the crowd like a woman on a mission. When our eyes met, I nearly lost my balance. "I got an earlier flight," she said, pulling me into a tight hug that felt like a warm coat thrown over frozen shoulders. "I couldn't let you walk into this alone." I couldn't speak. I just nodded, because in that moment, something inside me, something heavy and exhausted, exhaled. We stood together off to the side during the ceremony rehearsal, watching as the coordinator directed people like chess pieces on a pastel board. Rachel was already glowing in her dress, lips pursed in a pouty smile that somehow looked both regal and rehearsed. Blake looked polished, distracted, and vaguely bored. And then I heard something I wasn't meant to hear, something that shattered the last illusion I had that this day was simply a display of familial dysfunction. "I told Dad we could offer her a job if she behaves," Rachel whispered to Blake, her voice crisp beneath the sound of soft music. "It'll be good PR. Makes us look generous." Blake chuckled. "You're too nice." Rachel shrugged. "She needs to feel like she's still part of the family, or at least let her believe it for now." I'm for. It felt like someone had emptied a glass of ice water straight into my lungs. I stood frozen, too stunned to move, too hurt to react, and Naomi, who had heard it too, turned to me with wide eyes and whispered, "Are you okay?" But I wasn't. Because everything made sense now: the vague offers, the awkward texts, the sudden inclusion in photos and seating plans. It wasn't a gesture of reconciliation. It was a performance. A political maneuver. They had reduced me to a strategy. I felt humiliated, not just because they had said it, but because a part of me had believed they might mean it this time. That maybe all the silent treatment and cruelty had turned into something more fragile, more open. But no. I wasn't family, I was leverage. I walked away from the courtyard, my heels clicking on the stone like a warning bell, my hands trembling, but not with sadness. No, this wasn't sadness anymore. It was fire. And for the first time in a very long time, I stopped holding it in. I went to my car, pulled out the envelope I had tucked in the glove box days ago, the one I debated opening, burning, forgetting, and I stared at it for a long moment before peeling the flap. Inside were the copies of the will. The original draft my father had filed 2 years earlier, where the estate had been split evenly between Rachel and me, and the revised version that had suddenly been updated without any legal counsel copied to me, filed quietly, with a notary from Blake's firm instead of our family's longtime attorney. I'd gotten them from a former legal contact who owed me a favor. I hadn't planned to use them. I thought I would just keep them, like a memento of the betrayal. But now I saw it for what it really was, not just injustice, but manipulation. And I'd had enough. I walked back into the venue, eyes clear, shoulders back, that envelope tucked under my arm like a quiet promise. When the wedding officiant called for anyone who wanted to give a toast before the vows, the room buzzed softly with awkward energy. Everyone looked at each other, hesitant, waiting for someone else to step forward. I didn't wait. I walked to the mic. Rachel's eyes narrowed as I took the stage, her lips tightening, her hand tightening around Blake's arm. My mother sat frozen. My father looked confused. But Naomi stood in the back, arms crossed, eyes steady on me, and I swear it gave me strength. I took a breath. I wasn't going to say anything today, I began, my voice calm but resonant, but sometimes silence becomes its own kind of violence, and I've been silent long enough. There was a ripple in the crowd, an invisible shift, and I knew I had their attention. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't pointed fingers. But I had cracked something, I could feel it. And I wasn't done. I wasn't going to say anything today, I repeated, and I could feel the way the air changed, how everyone's movements slowed like a scene thickening into slow motion. As if even the walls leaned in to listen, not to a scandal, but to something inevitable, something years in the making that had finally cracked its silence wide open. My voice was steady, but my heart pounded beneath the fabric of my dress, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, older, the pulse of a girl who had waited her entire life to be heard, not out of pity, not out of performance, but because she had something real to say. I've been quiet most of my life, I said, eyes scanning the Crowder family, friends, distant relatives, old church members, all of them sipping wine and blinking up at me like they weren't quite sure if this was a toast or a reckoning. And I let that uncertainty hang, let it thicken, because I wanted them to feel it, the tension I'd swallowed for decades finally breathing. I was raised in a family where love came with conditions, where worth was measured in appearances, and success meant one thing only, being Rachel. Rachel shifted in her seat, her smile stretched too tight now, no longer graceful, and Blake whispered something to her, but she didn't look away from me, and that was fine. She didn't have to look away, because I was done hiding. I used to think I just wasn't good enough. I continued, and I saw my father flinch, subtle but real, and my mother pressed her fingers to her lips as if to hold back something sharp. But now I know that no matter what I achieved, it was never about being good enough. It was about playing a role I was never cast in. And when I stepped outside that role, when I built something for myself, when I didn't ask for permission, you called it distance. You called it pride. But it was survival. The silence was total now. Not a glass clinked, not a chair shifted. I took a breath, one that tasted like ashes and freedom. I was told by my sister, by my parents, by people in this room that I didn't belong, that my work wasn't real, that I was too cold, too ambitious, too much. And still, I showed up. I showed up when I wasn't invited, when I was ignored, when I was erased. All laid. My voice broke just slightly there, and I let it, because the pain was real, and I had earned the right to let it be heard. And now I know the truth. I pulled the envelope from under my arm, holding it with both hands like a judge handing down a sentence, and the tension in the room turned electric. This, I said, is a copy of my father's original will, dated 2 years ago, before it was changed, before I was erased. Oklo. I heard the gasp before I even finished the sentence, and then a low murmur rolled through the crowd like distant thunder. My father stood up halfway from his seat, his face pale, eyes darting between me and the envelope as if he were searching for some version of the story he could still control. "And this," I said, pulling the second sheet free, "is the revised version. Conveniently signed by someone from Blake's firm. Not our family attorney, not a witness. Just a transaction that cut me out without a conversation." Rachel stood then, her voice tight. "What are you doing, Shayla?" I turned to face her. "I'm telling the truth. The truth you've twisted for years. The truth you've hidden behind your perfect smile and your carefully crafted narrative. You've always believed you were the center of everything, that I was just orbiting around you, but I'm not a supporting character in your fairy tale, Rachel. I never was." My mother stood now too, her voice sharp. "Shayla, this isn't the time." I looked her straight in the eye, the woman who had raised me with rules instead of affection, with standards instead of warmth, and said, "You don't get to decide when my truth is allowed. Not anymore." "Oh." Blake tried to smooth things over with a corporate tone, probably the one he used in boardrooms. But Naomi stood from the back, walked forward slowly, heels clicking like punctuation, and said, "Loud enough for everyone to hear, you silenced her long enough." That cracked it open. People started whispering. Guests looked at each other, looked at the bride, at the groom, at the parents. The illusion fractured. I turned back to the mic. "I didn't come here to ruin a wedding," I said, voice calm again. "I came here to tell you I'm done pretending. I'm done begging for scraps at a table I helped build. I'm done letting a family who wouldn't even call me when Grandma died rewrite the story like I never mattered." I looked at Rachel, really looked at her not as my sister, not as the girl who always got more, but as a woman who had made a choice every single time I was left out, and I said, "I forgive you. But I don't forget. And I'm not going to stay quiet just to protect your comfort." Rachel's mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to say. I stepped away from the mic. The silence was deafening. But it wasn't the silence of shame. It was the silence of awakening. And for the first time in my life, I felt seen, not because they finally accepted me, but because I finally stopped needing them to. And that, more than anything, was power. I walked away from the microphone feeling like I had just taken my first breath in years, not because I had finally hurt them back, not because I had embarrassed them in front of an audience they handpicked to applaud their curated version of reality, but because I had finally spoken with nothing left to Locino filter. No smile for the camera grace, no attempt to soften the truth to make it more digestible for people who had spent years choking me with silence. And in that breath, in that quiet but seismic moment of self-ownership, I realized that I didn't need a single one of them to approve. Because the truth didn't need permission to exist, it just needed space to be heard. The room didn't explode, not in the dramatic, movie-like way I used to fantasize about when I imagined what it would be like to finally be seen. Instead, it cracked, slowly and visibly, like glass under pressure. My father sat down heavily, eyes hollow, hands trembling slightly in his lap as if he had been caught in a storm he never expected would come from his own daughter. And my mother reached for him, her fingers not quite meeting his, frozen in that half-hover that spoke volumes about the distance between them no one else ever acknowledged. Rachel didn't say a word. She just stood there, stone-faced, as the crowd shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable now, whispering, avoiding eye contact. She didn't cry, she didn't rage, she didn't break. But something in her expression, tight, strained, the corners of her mouth twitching as she tried to control it, told me that she had finally felt what I had felt my entire life. The fragile heat of being exposed, the embarrassment of having your carefully designed identity questioned under bright lights and too many eyes. The officiant, poor man, tried to bring things back to order with a half-hearted smile and an awkward, "Shall we take a moment before continuing?" And people murmured agreements, grateful for the excuse to escape the tension. Most of them shuffled outside, whispering in huddles, not brave enough to say anything to my face, but no longer confident in the script they had been given. I stepped out into the garden, the fresh air rushing into my lungs like absolution. Naomi following close behind, quiet but steady, the one person who had never looked through me like I was a shadow trying too hard to cast herself into the light. She didn't say anything right away, she didn't need to, and when she finally did, it was just this. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I was too full of everything relief, grief, anger, releasito speak. It wasn't long before the fallout began. Later that evening, after the wedding limped forward in some hollow form, Rachel managing to paste a smile back onto her face long enough for the vows, Blake stiff and robotic, their kiss met with the softest applause I'd ever heard at a wedding. I got a text from my father. It read, "We need to talk." I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I no longer needed answers from a man who had already made every decision count against me. I let the message sit unread for hours, then finally opened it before bed and typed only one sentence in response. I've already said what I needed to say. The next day, Naomi and I packed our things and left early. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. There were no hugs, no forced apologies, no attempts at reconciliation. And as we drove away from that sprawling venue, that monument to everything I'd never been invited to truly belong to, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I had won in some traditional sense, but because I had finally stopped playing a game that was rigged from the start. But consequences have a way of rippling. A week later, I got a call from the family's longtime lawyer, a kind, older man named Gerald who had known me since I was a child and used to sneak me butterscotch candies during long meetings I was too young to understand. His voice was gentle but serious. "Shayla," he said, "I've received a request to review the revisions made to your father's will. Apparently, there's been some confusion." I waited, silent. "I've looked over everything," he continued, "and frankly, it's a mess. No witnesses, improper notarization, and legal grounds for a challenge. I just thought you should know that if you wanted to contest it, you'd have a strong case." I swallowed hard. "And what would that change?" He paused. "It might not change them, but it would protect what's rightfully yours." I didn't give him an answer that day. I didn't need Tono yet. Because the truth was, it wasn't about money or property anymore. It was about having the option. The voice, the power I had been denied my whole life was now sitting squarely in my hands, not to use out of revenge, but to remind myself that I wasn't powerless anymore. And Rachel? Well, the cracks had begun to show. Word spread fast in our small community, and it wasn't long before people started questioning things, not just the will, but her character, her choices, the smug way she'd always operated as if she was owed everything without ever having to earn it. The wedding buzz turned to gossip, and though she tried to spin it as drama caused by a jealous sister, too many people had heard the truth with their own ears. The cracks in her perfect image deepened, and for once, she had to face life without the cushion of being everyone's favorite. The victory wasn't loud. It didn't come with applause or headlines or even vindication from my parents, who still refused to say the words I had longed to hear. But it came in other ways. It came in the quiet email from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. "Thank you for saying what no one else ever had the courage to." It came in the phone call from Grandma's neighbor, who said, "Your grandmother always spoke so highly of you, you know. She kept your college essay in her drawer, read it out loud once at church." And it came, most of all, in my own reflection, calm, unapologetic, and finally, undeniably whole. I had lost nothing that day. I had finally claimed myself. It didn't happen all at once. The piscino, it came slowly, like morning fog lifting inch by inch, revealing the world beneath it not as something new, but as something that had always been there, waiting for me to see it clearly. In the weeks after the wedding, after the whispers died down and the texts from relatives stopped asking what really happened, and the awkward invitations to lunch dried up like puddles in sunlight, I found myself relearning how to breathe without checking first to see who was watching. There was something quietly revolutionary about existing on my own terms again, about waking up and not replaying old conversations or writing imaginary rebuttals in my head, not carrying the weight of someone else's version of me on my shoulders, as if I owed it to the world to shrink myself into something more palatable. I started going on walks in the mornings, no music, no phone calls, just the sound of my own footsteps and the birdsong that I hadn't noticed in years. It felt strange at first, like I had forgotten how to be still, how to exist without performing or protecting or preparing for another wound. But the quiet wasn't lonely anymore. It was sacred. It was mine. I refocused my energy on the business not as an escape, but as an act of creation again. The way it had been in the beginning when I was building something out of thin air, driven not by pain or defiance, but by vision. I started mentoring younger women who reminded me of myself, sharp-edged, ambitious, burning for a place to belong, and as I listened to their stories, I began to realize how many of us had been made to feel small in the rooms we were born into. How often we internalized rejection as proof that we were broken instead of evidence that the room had never been built with us in mind. And slowly, quietly, I forgave myself. For trying too hard. For staying too long. For hoping when I should have walked away. I looked back at all the times I had blamed myself for not being enough and saw them for what they were. Survival tactics in a world that never gave me permission to simply be. I started to love that girl again, the one who kept showing up, who kept giving, who kept dreaming even when her dreams were treated like noise. She hadn't failed, she had endured. Naomi, always steady, remained my anchor. We spent more evenings on my balcony than I can count, sipping wine and watching the city light up below us like 1,000 tiny victories blinking in the night. One evening, she said, "You've changed." I turned to her, startled. "Not in a bad way," she added. "You just seem softer, but stronger too." I thought about that long after she left. Because she was right. There was a strength that had replaced the striving, the kind that didn't need to be loud or sharp or armored anymore. I had lived through the worst of it, the erasure, the betrayal, the grief of realizing the people I wanted most to love me fully never truly did. And I was still here. Not in pieces, not in exile, but whole. One afternoon, months after the wedding, I got a letter in the mail, not an email, not a text. A real envelope with my name handwritten in familiar cursive across the front. It was from my father. I held it for a long time before opening it, unsure if I wanted to open old wounds just to confirm they hadn't healed. But when I did, the letter was brief. Not an apology, not an admission. Just a few short lines. "I heard you. I don't know what to do with what I heard, but I heard you. And I'm sorry it took me this long. Love, Dad." I didn't cry. But I did sit with it, the weight of what wasn't said pressing just as hard as the words that were there. It wasn't everything, it wasn't enough. But it was something. And for once, I wasn't the one chasing it. Rachel didn't reach out. Not directly. But I heard through a mutual friend that she had taken some time off work. That the pressure of the public fallout had shaken her more than she let on. That she had started therapy. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't want revenge. I just hoped, truly, for the first time that maybe she would find her own way out of the maze she had spent so long building around herself. As for me, I moved. Not far, but far enough. A new place with tall windows and sunlight that stretched across the hardwood floors every morning like a promise. I filled it with plants and books and silence. I painted one wall deep emerald, just because it made me feel calm. I made room for joy, messy, quiet, unfiltered joy that didn't ask for permission or applause. And I started writing again. Not for business. Not for a client, just for me. Stories. Letters. Truths I had never told. And slowly, a new chapter began, it born from rage or pain or rejection, but from something softer. Freedom. Not the kind of freedom you have to fight for every day. Not the kind that feels like a rebellion, but the kind that settles into your bones and makes space for your soul to stretch out and rest. The kind that doesn't ask you to prove anything to anyone. The kind that says, "You're enough, just as you are." And I believed it. Not all at once, but more every day. I look back now and see the girl I used to be, not with pity, not with regret, but with a kind of quiet awe, because she carried so much on her shoulders and never let it show. She gave love where she received indifference, offered silence where she deserved anger, smiled through rooms where she was barely tolerated, and still somehow believed that one day, if she just kept proving herself, they would finally let her in. And for a long time, that belief kept me going. It kept me hungry, kept me working, kept me striving toward a version of myself that might be acceptable to people who couldn't see my worth unless it mirrored their own reflection back at them. But now I understand something I didn't then. Healing doesn't always come with closure, and sometimes the apology you need most will never be spoken out loud. Sometimes the people who hurt you will never acknowledge what they did, and even if they do, it may not sound like what you wanted. It may not come wrapped in remorse or understanding, but healing, real healing, isn't about waiting for them to change. It's about deciding to stop bleeding for people who never bothered to notice you were hurt. I used to think strength meant holding it all in, being quiet, being composed, being the bigger person in a room that never made space for my truth. But now I know that strength also means speaking up, even when your voice trembles, even when your knees shake, even when no one claps for your honesty. It means honoring your own experience, even when others try to rewrite it, even when they call it drama or exaggeration or unforgiveness. It means choosing yourself, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. And I've chosen myself finally, fully, without apology. Not to hurt them, not to prove them wrong, but because I am done pretending that their love, or lack of it, defines who I am. I am more than the sister who stood in the background. I am more than the daughter who is passed over. I am more than the woman who built a life from ashes and kept looking back, hoping someone would see the fire and not just the smoke. I am not broken. I am not too much. I am not hard to love. I am whole, and that wholeness did not come from their validation. It came from truth, from courage, from every time I picked myself up when no one offered a hand. So if you're reading this, or hearing this, or carrying something like I carried, if you've ever been the forgotten one, the overlooked one, the one left off the list, left out of the photo, left behind while someone else basked in the spotlight, you need to know this. Your worth isn't measured by who sees you. It's measured by how deeply you see yourself. You don't have to keep begging to be let in. You don't have to keep smiling through disrespect and calling it strength. You don't have to keep waiting for someone else to write your story. You can stand up. You can speak. You can walk away. You can claim joy, even if no one claps when you do. You can live free, even if the people you love never understand what they lost by not choosing you. And you can heal. Not perfectly, not quickly, but deeply. And when you do, you'll find something on the other side of grief, something I never believed I'd reach until I stood in front of that microphone, something no one can take away once you find it. Peace. It's quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just slips into your life slowly, like sunlight warming a cold room. And one day you'll wake up, look around, and realize you are not waiting anymore. You are already home.